record to the cloud, and on your screens, do you see it says it's being recorded?
Yes, meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so hello to all those who are watching and listening to the recording. Okay, so today's our last class, and before our summer break, and we begin the week after Labor Day in the fall. So I just want to finish this unit, and I know there are three texts in this unit, so we may not look at all three of them, but I have sent out to those who received the text. I have sent out the all three of the last text in this chapter. Rabbi Marmash in her book calls it Modern Israel, but I have added to that title because it's really Modern Israel. As we looked at last week, the question of siege and the question which was raised by by the writer Rabbi Shlomo Goren was, first of all, can we apply the rules of warfare from ancient times in the Bible to today's warfare, and what did that or what did that mean? And there were some real interesting questions raised about what types of war one was dealing with, and the question of, are you dealing with an enemy who is intentionally, is intentionally going to wipe you out, as the case of Midian, which is an objective standard that you have in perhaps in warfare, versus dealing with the question of a robber who breaks into your house at night, and there is some subjective matters in trying to fully determine what the attacker's motivations are, right? I thought that was fascinating. I just would point out that I was listening this morning as I was walking in the park to a podcast which was talking about Bernard Goetz. In the case, some of you remember the subway vigilante who, and that question was actually legally raised in that case as to, was there an objective threat to him, or was it a subjective threat, but was the subjective threat of such a high level that he was able to could defend himself as he did? Interesting question. Perhaps worth going into at some other class. But for right now, we're going to finish. There are three texts. We're not obviously going to be able to get through all three of them, but this is a question which, by the way, we're seeing today. This question of ceding, the first one is ceding territory. Whoops, I'm sorry, that's not the first one. That is okay.
Yeah.
There it is. She's got text 3, 4, and 5. Um, the question, this is from a conservative rabbi, and the other two will be from Orthodox rabbis, about ceding land. The issue that is being raised, notice he says, a response on the issue of the greater land of Israel and halacha. So here's the larger question. We certainly know that God promises the land of Israel to our ancestors, and our ancestors dwelled there and lived there and had sovereignty at various times. Sovereignty finally ended during the period of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the second century of the Common Era. But certainly for sure, we know that there was sovereignty after the conquest of the land by Joshua. And then there were the kingdoms of King David and King Solomon. There was the Maccabees. We had sovereignty, and there are divine promises in the Bible. God says to Abraham, "I will give you this land." So the larger question is, if God gave us this land, does that mean that there is something that God gave to us that we cannot, because it's divinely given to us, give up for the sake of peace or for any reason? The greater land of Israel. In other words, there's something called the greater land of Israel, and we have every right to be on every single inch of it. We cannot give it up. Or if we don't have every inch of it, we have to go out and be sure that we conquer every single inch of it. Is that a divine commandment? Does that divine commandment supersede, shall we say, practical types of arguments you might make in a realpolitik way of looking at the Middle East, i.e., there are realities on the ground which don't line up with what the Bible says? And if that's the case, what takes precedence? What the Bible said or the realpolitik of the facts on the ground? And unfortunately, in some very negative ways, I would argue, those arguments, even to this day, to this very day, are being dealt with by the government of the state of Israel. But we'll see what some of these rabbis have to say. Okay, any comment or question before we begin? No? Okay. So we're going to start with a conservative rabbi who has made Aliyah. So he's living in Israel, and therefore, we can say that he has credibility on this one. Rabbi, here's Thomas, Theodore Friedman, 1908, 1992. He was in the United States. He got his degrees from City College, JTS. He was a very foremost spokesperson and activist for Soviet Jewry. He went to Birmingham, Alabama to protest police brutality. He was a professor at JTS. And then he subsequently retired to Israel. He was chair of their halachic organization, the Vaad HaHalacha, the RA's responsive committee addressing specific questions to Israel. And now he is concerning the public declaration by the Orthodox Chief Rabbinate of Israel that the boundaries of the land of Israel must be defined as the widest extent found in Jewish textual sources. As Rabbi Friedman will point out, it's a little bit unclear. When we say the land of Israel, in our heads, we have this picture, right, of the map of Israel. We know what that looks like. But when the Bible talks about the land of Israel, and when the rabbis in ancient times talk about the land of Israel, what exactly are they talking about? And if we can determine what they're talking about, can any of it be relinquished for the sake of a peace treaty? Okay, that is the question that we're going to address. So here he begins. The Chief Rabbinate has published an article and an ad in the press stating that according to halacha, it is forbidden to cede even an inch of any part of the greater land of Israel. What is the position of the Vaad HaHalacha, the conservative movement, on this? Okay, so they've said officially they can't. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
it's Judith. I have a question
Yeah.
to start with. Was the Sinai Peninsula taken in the 67 war part of, is that considered extra land or was that ours?
Okay, good question. So the larger question that you're asking, and you're asking about a specific part of it, which is really one of the questions that Rabbi Friedman will deal with. What is the land of Israel? I.e., does the land of Israel, where's the border? Is the border the Nile River? Is the border the Sinai Peninsula? Right? You're asking, we'll see how he answers that, right? But we all know certainly that in 67, we're talking about the Sinai, talking about the Golan, talking about the West Bank, talking about East Jerusalem, right? All of those areas which prior to 67. By the way, if some of you may be familiar with the partition map of 48. If we look at the partition map that the UN suggested, remember 1948 UN said there should be a Palestinian state and there should be a Jewish state, and they came up with a map. A map where the state of Israel was much smaller. The pre-67 borders of Israel were actually the ceasefire lines after the War of 48. And as Judith pointed out, after 67, the ceasefire lines included the West Bank, the Golan, and the Sinai. Okay, so let's see what Rabbi Friedman has to say about those areas. But that's a good question. Well, I think you'll see his opinion. Okay, Rabbi states categorically that the sources will demonstrate that, contrary to what the Orthodox Rabbinate has declared, the borders of the land of Israel were flexible, and no such concept as the greater land of Israel exists in the Bible, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, or in the Midrash. That's, that's the, if you say that, you've really contradicted what the rabbinate is saying. And it's characteristic of a conservative Masorti rabbi. The question is historical development. We don't believe that there's one statement, ahistorical, comes from God. It's always true. It's always 100% true. You just can't even argue because it's from God. He says, no, that's not the way these things works. Okay. The sources do not mention the concept of the greater land of Israel. In other words, even this idea of a greater land of Israel is a modern invention. Yes, you have Israel and you have borders, but somehow there's a divine, the Orthodox rabbis, when they're talking about this, they assume that they're talking about something that is divine and immutable. And he's saying, no, that's not the way it is. Anyone who takes even a modest survey on the issue of the borders of the land of Israel will conclude in the biblical, rabbinic, the borders have expanded or contracted. Why? Political reasons, right? In the period of the rabbis, one cannot speak of a stable borders,
That's true.
about places that were mentioned as part of the land of Israel and cities and towns that were mentioned as outside the land of Israel. So there's a great deal of variability. Okay. Where do these ambiguities come from? So it starts with Abraham. To your seed, I have given this land from the Egyptian river to the great river of the Euphrates. Nowadays, where would that go from? Let's answer Judith's question. Would that include the Sinai? Well, from what's the Egyptian river? It's the Nile. The Nile is west of the Sinai Peninsula. Yes?
Yes.
So if you start at the Nile and you go, what country is the Euphrates in?
Iraq.
Iraq. So if you say from the Nile to the Euphrates, yes, you're including the Sinai. You're including Israel. You're including parts of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. That's a big part of land. I don't have the maps in front of me, but can we visualize that? We're considering a huge amount of land. Think about from the Nile to the Euphrates, where all those other countries exist nowadays. In identifying the Egyptian River, there is disagreement. Most people think it's the Nile. However, some people might say that it's a wadi, between the wadi, and there's 100 kilometers from the Nile. But we're still talking on the Sinai, right? I mean, even if you move east from the Nile 100 kilometers, you still are putting most of the Sinai into the land of Israel. If you assume that that's an immutable statement about the size of the land of Israel that God has given to the Jewish people. Okay. Points out that elsewhere in the Bible, there's only one border that was fixed, the Mediterranean. Well, I think that's fairly easy and obvious, right? What are you going to do? The Mediterranean certainly is the end of the landmass. But it was unclear which part of the Mediterranean seashore, right? The Mediterranean seashore, right, goes on the Sinai, goes all the way up through Lebanon, Syria, right? As for the changes, well, there's the conquest of King David, included Ammon, Moab, and Edom, east of the Jordan, okay? The Aramean lands in southern Syria, and in the heyday of David and Solomon, from the borders of the kingdom of Tyre, that's pretty far north into Syria, and Hamath to the north, and from the Euphrates River in the north to Eilat, to the kingdom of Egypt. The term the land of Israel was much broader. Yeah, it's no question. If you want to argue from the time of King David and King Solomon, yeah, it was quite large. However, Rabbi Furman points out, it did not last long. As early as the end of the reign of King Solomon, and definitely after the division of, let's go back, of the monarchy, right? which is narrating that Solomon ceded 20 cities in the land of the Galilee to Hiram of Tyre. In other words, Tyre. In other words, even in times of the Bible, the borders changed. And even King Solomon, the great wise King Solomon, gave up some land in exchange for the materials of the temple and palace that Hiram supplied. Hey, you know, I need a lot of stuff to build the temple. Tell you what I'll do. Let's make a deal. You give me this, you give me the wood, you give me the stones, and I'll give you some land. And the Bible does not say that that was forbidden. From then on, the area remained in the Upper Galilee within the territory of the kingdom of Tyre. That's the northern part of Israel, Upper Galilee. Okay. What about Jordan? On the death of King Ahab, the kingdom of Moab was included in the border of the kingdom of Israel. And when it threw off the rule of the kingdom of Israel, it became independent. So even on another direction, the changes occurred. It's complicated. One clear lesson: it is impossible to instill boundary markers and declare that here the border of the land of Israel begins and here it ends. Only one boundary is fixed. Surprise, the Mediterranean, as the western borders, but among the classical rabbis, a dispute emerged. Which part of the Mediterranean Sea? In other words, how far north do you go? How far into Lebanon? How far south do you go? All of the Sinai? If you go all the way across from the Sinai to the Nile, past the Nile, to the Nile, between the Nile and Sinai? Unclear. Okay. Now, going past the biblical period, now we're talking about a period in the latter part of this period where there was no independent Jewish state. The rabbis discussed the borders. But here's what's interesting. They are interested not in the political boundaries, but in determining which areas were and were not subject to ritual laws tied to the land of Israel. In other words, if we have rules, if you live in the land of Israel, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Well, you need to know whether you're in the land of Israel, right? You need to know if you're in Canada and the United States to know which taxes you're going to pay. So you need to have a border and you need to know which side of the border that land is on. Furthermore, identifying and locating the places may be a riddle that cannot be solved, right? The interest of the classical rabbis in the question of the borders of the land of Israel did not flow from being a political question. As early as the first century BCE, when Pompey, the Roman minister, intervened in the war between the Hasmonean brothers, Jewish political sovereignty disappeared. The rabbis' interest and determination of the boundaries stem from the question of which areas were subject to the laws of the mitzvot, such as Terumot and Maaseh. In other words, certain tithes and gifts to the temple were incumbent upon people who lived in the land of Israel. But if you didn't live in the land of Israel, you didn't have to give them. First fruits, bikurim, which areas were considered free and exempt from these. Okay. The meaning of this latter determination is that a Jew who goes outside the land of Israel automatically becomes ritually impure. Well, if he becomes ritually impure, first of all, we need to know where that occurs, right? Quite a blow to the priests because it would prevent them from serving in the temple while its existence and prevent it from eating truma. In other words, very specific rules. So this question about whether you're in the land of Israel or out of the land of Israel in temple times had important implications. Okay, so they have to figure out what it is. The main difficulty stems from identifying and locating places mentioned in the sources. Places appearing in one list are absent in others, in different manuscripts of the same existing source. Anyway, how do we know? We'll look at the sources from that time. But the sources from that time are inconsistent, different spelling, right? For example, the Palestinian Talmud mentions a place called, what Rabbi Friedman is doing here is he's just giving you the three Hebrew letters in that name, where Shin, Kuf, and Lamed, at Shin, K, SKL, right? An inscription from Beit, Shian, the same place as SGL. The places are far apart. There were differences of opinion. There are two maps, one of the land of Israel, and the other indicates between these two lines there is considerable distance. In other words, so you read these sources, and you're not even sure, are they talking about we can think in terms of there are places in the United States that have similar names, and you don't want to confuse them. And what if the maps are not clear? What if they don't, they wrote them out, or they made a mistake, or they were talking about the other place? We're not sure. This issue continues to vex contemporary scholars. Okay. The rabbis but saw the criterion to determine whether a place was to be deemed a part of the land of Israel was its percentage of Jewish versus non-Jewish inhabitants. Now that's now you don't have to, now you're not even talking about what did the Bible say, what did King David say, what did Solomon and David conquer? Just who lives there, okay? The population of a given city in the land of Israel waxed and waned. So sometimes the same place could be part of Israel, and sometimes could be not part of Israel. It just changed over time, right? As unfortunately we know for many reasons, there are places all around the world where that has changed. Furthermore, the city was determined to be part of the land of Israel according to one benchmark and not according to another. We will try. I mean, does this sound like trying to determine congressional districts? We will try to prove that in the considerations, the rabbis were very pragmatic and not guided by historical factors. Historical factors, how big was this when King David was king, or King Solomon? Or abstract ideology, what God said to Abraham. Their sole consideration was the number of Jewish inhabitants. If the percentage of the Jewish population was high, it was in the land of Israel. If not, not. The rabbis also disagreed on whether one place was the land of Israel or not, because sometimes the population was unsteady. It could grow, it could shrink. We find cases where one city was considered outside, but when its Jewish population grew, it was inside. That is to say, from one halakhic point of view, the place was considered part of the land of Israel, and in another respect, it is outside. You see the case he's drawing that the rabbis were very pragmatic about this and therefore had different criteria. Caesarea. Any of you have been to Caesarea? Right, it's a port on the Mediterranean. There are beautiful. The Romans made it one of their major ports. There's an amphitheater. There's a hippodrome. It's a beautiful seaside town. Okay. Rebuilt by Herod in 10 BCE. The city was a typical Roman city, so the rabbis did not declare it. The city was typical Roman cities, and the rabbis did not delay in declaring it outside the land of Israel. Now think about that. When we think about Israel today and Caesarea, clearly everyone would say, oh, that's inside, it's certainly inside the state of Israel, right? How can you doubt that? It's right there on the Mediterranean. It's up in the north somewhat, but it's right in the land of Israel. But the rabbi said, no, too many non-Jews living there, outside. One may speculate that its polytheistic culture dissuaded Jews from settling in it, you want to live in a town that's got a lot of Jews, right? That's what people did then as well as today. However, later, after the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt, again, first century Common Era, most of the Jewish population was in the Galilee and nearby places. The number of Jewish residents in Caesarea increased and the city became a Torah center, i.e., once the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, many of the Jews who had lived in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem moved north or towards the coast. So now population changes are happening, right? Therefore, in the light of reality, the sages have repeatedly stated that Caesarea is included. And now sometimes the rabbis made a compromise regarding a specific place in that from one perspective, it was part of the land, and from another is not. Consider Ashkelon. Okay, some of you maybe Ashkelon is on the Mediterranean. Think south of Tel Aviv. Okay, don't remember exactly how far south, but can you visualize that? You know, if the way the Mediterranean, the land of Israel, it curves around, so you go south of Tel Aviv. Initially, as the rabbis determined, it was outside the land of Israel. However, from another source, they said it's part of the land of Israel. Somebody took account in the days of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, again, 2nd century Common Era. Despite this, the city of Ashkelon was considered in several respects outside, and the rules of certain required gifts to the temple did not apply, and so it was outside, and therefore the rules did not apply to it. Finally, his conclusion. From this brief survey, it is clear that in determining which places were part of the land and which places are outside, the rabbis were guided by pragmatic concerns. The consideration of the boundaries was never fixed and rigid, but the opposite, flexible in accordance with the pragmatic reality. How many Jews lived there, and the other pragmatic concerns. To claim the concept of the greater land of Israel forbids us from conceding any part of the geographic land that happens to be under Jewish sovereignty has no support in the halacha. There, by the way, that would include necessarily the Sinai, which was under the rule of the state of Israel after 67. This agreement relative to the greater land of Israel concept is strictly a political dispute with no halachic relevance whatsoever. Leave it to the politicians. Don't try to make it sound like there's Jewish law, and if you're an Orthodox Jew who believes that Jewish law is divine and unchangeable, determines what is going to be the boundaries. Okay? Comments on this? Comments or questions on this? It's making a strong case, right? Okay.
I thought the Torah says that our sovereignty is all the way to the Euphrates.
Right, it does. If that is true, therefore the state of Israel will be required to send its army out and conquer all the land between the current boundary of the land of Israel going into Syria and Iraq. And you could argue that that's a divine commandment. We can't question it. We saw in Abraham. Abraham, it said from the Nile to the Euphrates.
And by the way, in the Torah, I think it's in Yisro, it says that God says, "I will give you back the land little by little, not all at once."
Yeah, there are some contradictory statements within the Torah itself, right? Which talks about giving the land little by little, not all at once. But and we can see that in the conquest by Joshua. But even if that is true, whether it's little by little or all at once, we still are trying to talk about the question of where does that end? What's the boundary? Okay. So Rabbi Friedman's argument is from a historical basis and based on text that there is within the Torah itself and within the rabbinic literature no absolute statement about this piece of land other than the Mediterranean, which I could say by obvious is the border. Okay, so let's take a look at see if we have time, at least for one or perhaps two other views about this. Okay. Now, this is from an Orthodox rabbi. This is going to be Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, very well-known Sephardic rabbi, very distinguished. He makes rulings, and people follow them. Okay. Since 1970s, with the peace treaty with Egypt, rabbinic decisors have debated whether halakha prohibits or mandates ceding of territory. You see I would argue, unfortunately, there are these settlers in the West Bank who are going and claiming land owned by Palestinians and saying, why are we doing this? Well, because God gave us this land. And if the government isn't going to do anything, we'll take it in our own, because God has told us that we have to take this land, and we're going to try to do what we can to get rid of the Palestinians. Okay. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in 1980, 1989. Now, at that time, again, it's true that some of these texts were based upon the historic period that they were written. And we know that we had the peace treaty with Egypt, right, in which the Sinai was given back. But as we said, again, Judith's question, was it part of the greater land of Israel? Well, if it goes to the Nile or even to one of the wadis, it was, but it was given back, right? But in talking about the 1980s, there was this question of the government of Israel negotiating or not negotiating with the PLO, which was regarded then as representing the Palestinians. Before the PA, well, even today we can't speak of a strong PA, but at least in those days we're just talking about the PLO. There was no Arab partner except for Egypt with who to make peace. And so what are the arguments about conceding? Well, the beginning of his teshuvah, Rabbi Yosef states he is not issuing a ruling. At the end, he reaches a conclusion that territories may be conceded for the sake of peace under certain circumstances. So he's saying there's no absolute, this is the territory and you can't budge from it. Okay?
Rabbi,
Yes.
in the Torah, it also says a number of places that God says the land is mine. The land of it belongs to God.
Right. And God has the ability to give, but God does give part of it, part of it to Abraham. Right. And that,
Yeah.
as you pointed out, that land that he gave to Abraham was from the Euphrates to the Nile. But that was not the reality at any time of any political entity of ancient times. And even King David and King Solomon was much, much smaller. Okay. So first he makes the point, the question is moot. He wants to know if the mitzvah of settling the land is greater than the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh. Now, notice he's taking a different tack. Okay, let's assume there is a mitzvah of Jews to live in Israel. Fine. But what if there is also a mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, mortal danger to human life? And hence a Jew is obligated to risk one's life to settle the land. But does this principle of pikuach nefesh suspend the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel? In other words, if you're going to settle the land of Israel, but to do that, lives are going to be lost in an unreasonable way, which is greater, settling the land or losing the life, right? I am not issuing, okay, so I'm not issuing a halakhic ruling. He was talking, there's no negotiating party. Okay. I have conferred with 4 experts concerning the military and political aspects of the question. Now, notice, he actually is not saying, I'm just looking at the Torah and I'm just looking at the sources, but he recognized there that there is a practical politics that comes into this discussion today. It's not just what did the Torah say and the issue is closed. He's dealing with military and political aspects. And they completely disagreed, each offering persuasive arguments. Sometimes that's the problem. Oh, instead of looking at just what the Torah says, let's talk to the real politic, to the military experts. Well, what happens if the military experts don't agree? Well, that's what Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is saying. One side argues that in light of modern weapon systems, such as long-range missiles, chemical warfare, and missile-bearing airplanes, there is no significance to the location of the border, whether we return parts of the land of Israel. The more important issue is the stationing of the military and the demilitarization of evacuated areas, What in Israel today they speak about buffer zones. The peace accords with Egypt show that Egypt is fulfilling the accords and diverted most of its budget from military to economic development. Therefore, we may assume, page, I'm sorry, that an agreement with the inhabitants of Judea and Samaria will reduce the chances of war with our neighboring countries. Okay, in other words, he's saying maybe there's a political solution to this. The opposite side argues that Judea and Samaria are vital. They provide strategic depth. It is too great a risk to cede these territories, even in return for peace, since the danger of terrorism remains in peacetime. How wide is Israel if you discount the West Bank, the narrowest part of Israel? Does anyone know?
About 6 miles.
I think about 11 miles. Yeah. In other words, if you take out the West Bank and you go from the Mediterranean to the West Bank, it's a very narrow area. And so the question is, there is it's 11, if it's 11 miles, well, an army could conquer that quickly and divide Israel into two pieces. And that's a strategic advantage to those who want to conquer Israel. I'll make it even worse. What happens if an army stations missiles on the West Bank overlooking Ben Gurion Airport? And Ben Gurion Airport cannot function because there are missiles that are going to be able to attack it because they're so close. So that's another question. If we sign a peace accord with some Arabs, this will not restrain the more extreme terrorists, and they will continue to fight. Okay. They argue that the defense of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem is dependent upon retaining Shechem, Nablus, and Hebron, i.e., some places in the West Bank. Well, those are those arguments. Oh, if you give up some, then you've lost it all. So in other words, he's saying, I see two military experts who are disagreeing. So what does he say? Excuse me. I support the prime minister, the deputy prime minister, and all the other ministers in their endeavors and completely endorse their recent actions, i.e. negotiations, land for peace, as it was called, whose purpose is to ensure security and peace for the inhabitants of the land. My goal here is to analyze the position advocated recently that the importance of the mitzvah of settling the land is greater than the mitzvah of preserving life, and one is obligated to risk one's life for the settlement of the land, i.e., one needs to go out and militarily take these places and hold these places. The question whether the principle of pikuach nefesh, mortal danger, suspends the mitzvah of settling the land, or whether, to the contrary, the political stalemate will lead to a situation. In other words, is a compromise allowed? Because even though you're giving up land, you are reducing the possibility of war. If you give up the land, then war will not occur. If you keep the land, that's going to cause war and the loss of life. Okay. So he begins by talking about the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel, which we understand is a mitzvah. The statement of our rabbis concerning the importance of the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel, its sanctity, the obligation to live in the land of Israel. Okay. And he quotes from a Talmudic source, which says, dwelling in the land of Israel is equivalent to all the mitzvah of the Torah. Okay, that does exist. Okay, so yes, it is a mitzvah to dwell in the land. But what about pikuach nefesh? What if there's immediate danger? Okay, it is a principle that pikuach nefesh suspends all the mitzvot, except for the prohibitions of avodah zarah, arayot, and murder. In other words, we've seen this before. The rabbis say, if someone says, commit the sin or I'll kill you, you commit the sin unless they say, the sin that I want you to commit is murder, idolatry, or forbidden sexual relations. Those three, you have to be martyred. You don't commit those sins. But any other sin, if they say we're going to kill you unless you commit that sin, eat this cheeseburger, I like to eat the cheeseburger, okay? You shall observe my laws, which human beings shall do, and live by them. Okay, fine. So he says, one who asks a rabbi whether to desecrate Shabbat or Yom Tov in order to save a life is shedding blood, since the person is liable to die when he goes out to ask, and the rabbi who is asked is worthy of censure. Okay, it's a little complicated, but let's go to the summary. The settling of the land of Israel is not listed as one of the three mitzvot, right? In ancient times, the rabbis did say, do you have to sacrifice your life? If you're living in the land of Israel and someone says to you, you're living in the land of Israel and following this mitzvah, I want you to get out of the land of Israel. If you don't get out of the land of Israel, I will kill you. But it's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. The rabbi said, you go out of the land of Israel, you are then not following the mitzvah, but you're saving your life. And just like if the person asked you to commit idolatry, a sexual sin, or murder, you are required to save your life, only to give up your life only for those three. And settling in the land of Israel is not on the list. And if it was, and why didn't the rabbis put that? Murder, idolatry, sexual sins, or leaving the land of Israel. Nope, not on the list. So he's making that point. Okay. Are we clear so far? All right. So you notice which way he's moving about giving up land. There's another part which I'm not going to go into all the detail. There's this question that comes from the Torah, which says in the book of Deuteronomy, you should not allow certain non-Jews to live in the land. His argument is going to be that only applies to the idolaters of ancient times, and Christians and Muslims nowadays don't fall into that category. We've seen this in other discussions where the rabbis say that some of the rules about idolaters in ancient times, Christianity and Islam are not those idolaters. Okay, so we can let's not say that we are not allowed to allow non-Jews to live in the land because they're idolaters like they were in the biblical times. That doesn't apply. Okay. Rabbi Yosef argues that we should not rely on miracles and think that God will save us in war. Does that sound obvious? There's a major debate in Israel today where among the Haredi, the most Orthodox Jews, are not serving in the army. And why is the land of Israel being saved? Because they're studying Torah. Right? So you notice the mainstream rabbis like Avadia Yosef are not saying you just rely on miracles and God is going to save us. To protect ourselves, we continue to abide by the principle of saving life. Given our spiritual state, it would appear that it is prohibited for us to rely upon a miracle and risk a war with our neighboring Arab countries, for perhaps our sins will be are so great, God will not perform a miracle. Hence, we return to the principle that Pikuach Nefesh suspends the prohibition of ceding territories. Indeed, all Israeli governments refrained from annexing the territories in order to allow for the possibility of negotiations based on ceding territories for peace. Okay. All right. So he's clearly basing this on both a pragmatic principle, but he finds this pragmatic principle in the sources. It is more important to prevent an imminent danger of war than to be concerned about the possibility of a future one. So in other words, the question of whether or not, here's the question. Will ceding territories present a danger? Now, he admits that we can argue with that. If you give up territories, will that be seen as a weakness and encourage armies to attack Israel? Or will ceding territories be seen as a pragmatic response of the Israeli government, that the other side will be also pragmatic and think, oh, we shouldn't go to war. And that one can argue. Yeah, Jack, you have a question? Jack, I see that your hand is up. And you're muted, so we can't hear you. Okay, why don't you try to figure out how to unmute, and then we'll be able to hear you. Okay. All right. So here's his conclusion. If it can be determined without any doubt that a genuine peace between us and our Arab neighbors will result from ceding territories, whereas not ceding the territories will increase the danger of immediate war, then the territory should be returned, as nothing stands in the way of pikuach nefesh. The matter must be analyzed carefully after consultations with military commanders and political leaders who are expert in these matters. He's not saying you just take out the Torah. May God inspire the government ministers and advisors to do everything for the good of the community in the land of Israel, and so on and so on. What do you think of his conclusion? Agree, disagree? Is he being realistic, unrealistic? Does this seem something that was said in the 1980s that nowadays might not be as popular as it was then?
I don't see how any of us, any human being, can conclude that we should give over some of the land, because it doesn't. The bottom line is, the land belongs to God. God.
Are you saying that the decision should be based upon some of the Torah as opposed to practical military leaders?
When it comes to the land itself, yes.
Okay. Now, again, the question is still then, what exactly is the land? It's still a question of what the borders are.
Yeah.
Okay. So other comments to this? What do you think he's right? Is he right for then, right for now? Comments?
He's right. He was right then, and he's right now. You can't go by what it says in the Torah. I looked up. Torah said an eye for an eye. We're not pushing anybody's eyes out now, and you have to interpret it for the times. And this was good. Unfortunately, Gaza did not work out because Hamas came in, but we also have to negotiate for the present. And the political leaders and the military leaders have to decide. So some of the people who are on the West Bank now became, very right wing and very militant, and they're not helping our cause at all.
Okay. Anyone else comment as to what he's saying? Again, notice, if it can be determined without any doubt that a genuine peace between us and our Arab neighbors will result from ceding territories. Yeah, Rini.
Well, if we don't come to some agreement about the territory, we will be in a constant state of war forever. And that doesn't seem to make any sense either.
Well, there's also the demographic issues of what over time the land will have a majority Arab population. If you take Gaza and the West Bank and into the state of Israel, given time, that area will have a majority added to the land of the state of Israel. At some point, there will be a majority Arab population, right there. So there's a real practical issue, which I'm afraid is not being discussed sometimes. Although I have to admit, how do you think Israelis feel about this nowadays?
Does it depend on who you are in Israel and where you are? If you're very, the settlers may have one point of view, and other Israelis may have another point of view. I don't know, because I don't live there.
Yeah, I would say this. What Rabbi Yehudi Avadia Yosef is actually talking about is a two-state solution. I mean, that's the term. It is not very popular in Israel nowadays. And I think part of the reason was because of the Hamas attack on October 7th that really helped that really pushed a lot of Israelis to the right. Although the question is, yeah, we understand that, and certainly understandable, but still there's a long-term issue about how do you come to peace.
Rabbi,
Ed,
it's
and
so,
then Judith. Okay, Judith and Ed. Okay, Ed first. Okay.
I consider myself to be very practical, but the Hamas, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, Iran are religious fanatics, and they've sworn the destruction of state of Israel. And as you saw, bombing the heck out of Iran didn't change their position one iota. The only way is the total destruction of this group of people.
Okay, regime change in Iran. Okay.
Iran, and well, then you got to stop them from feeding the guns and ammunition to all of the other proxies that they control.
It's a real, in other words, there are some new pragmatic issues that have come up since this was written. Okay, Judith, are you going to
no longer relevant. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Obviously a complicated issue with no simple issues, but you notice the different that Rabbi Friedman, I think, effectively argues you just can't talk about the greater land of Israel and not giving up an inch of land, because then you would have to go out and conquer Syria and Iraq for that matter. So let's not even pretend that is a valid way of looking at this. And the question arises with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is how you weigh those pragmatic issues. Is it interesting that he by the way, notice how careful he is. If it can be determined without any doubt that a genuine peace between us and our Arab neighbors will result.
Right.
You notice he's being very careful. Without any doubt, genuine peace. Those are hard situations to be certain of. And I think that is why Israel is very, right now, a lot of Israelis are questioning whether that is possible. What really happened in Israel is that the Second Intifada really moved a lot of Israelis to the right, thinking that the question is, are the Arabs willing to compromise, or are the Arabs so intent on totally destroying the state of Israel that any compromise will ultimately fail? I mean, that's the argument. And the other side is, well, you got to have some compromise, because if you don't, then you can have a majority Arab population. And how are you going to deal with that? So that is the other difficult point. The last article, which we're not going to have to look at in detail, I will just point out to those of you who get the text. This is from another Orthodox rabbi, and his, oops, I got to get that one. Let me get that one. Okay, there it is. He's going to argue somewhat differently. It's an Orthodox rabbi, and actually, just since we have only a couple of minutes later, let's take a look at how he concludes. It is completely prohibited to cede the territories that we liberated by the grace of God in a defensive war. He's talking about, of course, 67. This does not diminish the danger of the loss of life. It increases it. So he's arguing against Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. So he's simply saying that ceding any territory does not eliminate danger, rather it increases it. His argument ultimately is, again, a pragmatic one. If you give up some territory, it will only strengthen and encourage those forces which want to totally destroy the land of Israel, right? Not an easy argument to see, and I think we have to say that after October 7th, we can understand how Israelis feel a little less likely to feel that territorial compromise is possible in the near future. I would hope they would see it as an ultimate goal. Okay, any last comments or questions on this one? Oh, yeah, Rini?
Well, I appreciated the comment about a really true, lasting, honest peace. And I think that's the real difficulty. I think if the two sides, if there was a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, and everyone said live in peace, fine. And I think that's really difficult at this point. So, I would give up land for a true and lasting peace, but I think there's so much emotion and going on that it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah, especially when some of the adversaries' position is not just getting some land, but is the total destruction of Israel, which we know,
Right,
and,
right.
and its proxies. That's the position of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, all of them. It's not an easy situation, but ultimately, too, for Israel, should Israel be saying that ultimately our goal would be a two-state solution, but it has to be on a situation in which the other state is totally non-military, and there are guarantees and some people talking about buffers between the two. Southern Lebanon, should that be a permanent buffer zone? There are a lot of practicalities, but I do think that we do see how some of these statements about the greater land of Israel is, you got to be careful as to what that really has meant. Okay.
Rabbi, I have to wonder if the Arabs had accepted the two-state solution back in 48, how different all this would be.
Oh, it would be totally different. There would be a very large Palestinian state, a much smaller Israeli state, and I think many have argued that none of this would happen if the assumption was that the Arabs were in a position to say we'll compromise and let's get there was debate, by the way, with Ben Gurion. There were those who said to Ben Gurion, "Yeah, how can you accept the plan? It's too small." And Ben Gurion, by his force of his political viewpoint, which was correct, he says, "Let's take what they give us, even if it's too small, and even it may be indefensible. We got to take what we can get." And I think that's something that's totally lost in the discussions today, that it was the Arabs who invaded in 48 with the intention of totally destroying the state of Israel. I mean, that's an unfortunate. That was, yeah. Okay, Jack, you got yourself out of mute. Did you have a comment or question?
Rabbi?
Yes.
I had a thought. Maybe there's some other thing we could offer the Arab world to negotiate besides land all the time. And the thought comes to my mind, maybe it's technology. Maybe technology, if we could share technology and show the Arab world that we could increase their standard of living, that maybe they'll give up all this business of always taking land as a price for it.
Well, in other words, I hear what you're saying. If that were only true, if Hamas had only used all the money that they had to create in Gaza a high-tech, successful economic land, but they didn't. In other words, the intent to destroy the state of Israel, unfortunately, has been greater. But it would certainly be not. What you're saying is that wouldn't it be nice if the Arab world said, let's forget about trying to get inches of land. Let's talk about improving the lives of our people.
Right, exactly.
And unfortunately, that has not been the case in many in the Arab world to this point.
Well, maybe we haven't offered it enough technology to create a balance.
Sima, one more comment, and then we're just about over. Okay.
Yeah, first of all, Israel provides the majority of water for Jordan. So if we do have peace with the Arab countries, we do work with them and we do offer what we have to offer. So it's not like we're not giving something to a country that does want peace and does value its citizens. Hamas does not value the people, so they're never going to care about technology, Jack. That's not going to make it.
The value of conquering the land is much greater than providing a decent life for their citizens.
Well,
unfortunately.
the only thing is, if you say that, then you're going to end up with forever a war that's going to run around forever.
That's part of the problem we have today. I think we all agree that forever war is not a good situation for anyone. No clear solution here. But
Eventually, that's
we
very
understand that.
destructive to
Jack,
Israel.
I'm
because
sorry, Eddie.
Just one off-topic comment. If anyone saw the article about the Israeli flag that was put up at one of the World Cup games in California, and security made them take it down, but they allowed all of the Palestinian flags to stick
Well,
out.
there are other issues on which I think we all recognize are making this a very difficult time for Israel, Zionists and supporters of Israel. We are living in a very, very surprisingly and quickly changing time. But let's try to, our people have lived through some very tough times in the past. So let's hope that we will get through this one. And we'll see you all in the fall. Have a wonderful summer vacation.
Have a wonderful summer, everyone.
Absolutely.
you
Yeah,
too.
Rabbi Yasher Koach, thank you for these classes.
You're
Have a
welcome.
wonderful summer. Thank you.
Rabbi, remember
You too.
to
Have a great summer. Take care. Bye-bye.
remember to
Thank you.
renew
Bye.
again.
Thank you.